The lantern shattered. That was the first thing Daniel Mercer registered when consciousness dragged him back from the edge of oblivion. Not the howling wind that tore at his coat like something living and furious. Not the numbness spreading from his boots upward through his calves toward his knees. And not the horse who had long since pulled free of his grip and vanished into the white nothing. No, what pulled Daniel Mercer back to the land of the living was the sound of breaking glass, and then light, impossible, blazing, beautiful light, cutting through the blizzard like a blade through black cloth. He had been dying. He understood that with a clarity that surprised him. A man who had survived 3 cattle drives through the worst of Kansas, 2 gunfights in the streets of Abilene, and 1 poisoning in a saloon outside Dodge City ought to know the shape of his own mortality by now. And Daniel Mercer had come to know it very well indeed. He had felt it settling over him like a second skin as the snow piled against his back, and the cold turned from sensation into something that simply was, the way darkness simply was, the way silence simply was. He had stopped feeling his hands somewhere around midnight, and the blizzard had been building for 3 hours before that. But then the lantern appeared. Not steady, not still. It was swinging deliberate, rhythmic, a specific pattern. 3 slow arcs to the left, then 2 sharp swings straight down, then 3 slow arcs to the left again, over and over. Someone was signaling him. Someone had seen him or heard him or simply known against all reasonable odds that a man was dying in this storm and they were calling him home. Daniel Mercer did not believe in angels. He had seen too much of what men did to one another to hold any faith in divine intervention. But he believed in light because light was real, and that light was the most real thing he had ever seen in his entire 31 years on this earth. He moved. His legs did not want to cooperate. His coat had frozen at the shoulders into something resembling iron plate, and each step forward required a negotiation between his will and his body that felt less like walking and more like argument. The snow came to his knees in the drifts, and the wind pushed back against him as though it had a personal grievance. But the lantern kept swinging. 3 left, 2 down, 3 left. He followed it. He did not know how long it took. Time had gone strange inside the storm. But at some point, the ground beneath his feet changed from packed snow to wooden boards, and the wind dropped by half, and then there was a door in front of him, and behind that door was warmth and the smell of kerosene and pine boards and something baking, and a woman was standing with one hand on the door frame, and the other holding what remained of a lantern that had lost its glass chimney, just a bare flame on a wick, burning against all odds in the freezing air. And her dark eyes were blazing with something that was neither fear nor relief, but something that looked, impossibly, like absolute certainty. She had known he was out there. "Get inside," Theresa Barrett said, not a question. Not a plea. An instruction delivered with the calm authority of someone who gave instructions for a living and expected them to be followed. Daniel Mercer stepped inside the schoolhouse and collapsed. It had started 2 days before the storm, though Daniel had not known then that it would matter. He had ridden into the town of Caldwell, Kansas in November of 1878 with $60, a good horse named Patience, no specific destination, and a reputation that preceded him in the worst possible way through 3 counties. He was, by the general consensus of the frontier settlements between Wichita and the Colorado border, trouble. Not outlaw trouble. He had never robbed anyone who did not deserve it and had never shot anyone who was not already shooting at him. But the restless, unmoored kind of trouble that attached itself to men who had seen too much and settled to nothing. Daniel had been born in Missouri in 1847, raised on a farm that the war had destroyed before he was old enough to fight in it. He had drifted west afterward, as so many men had, carried on the current of post-war desperation and the myth of the open frontier. He had been a cattle hand, a scout, a brief and unsuccessful miner, and finally a sort of general drifter who hired himself out for skilled work when he needed money and moved on when he did not. He was good with horses, passable with a rifle, excellent with his hands carpentry, repair, the practical mechanical intelligence that frontier life demanded of anyone who wished to survive it. He had no particular dark secrets, no criminal past, no hidden motive in coming to Caldwell. He was simply a man who had not yet found a reason to stop. The town of Caldwell in 1878 was a cattle town sitting at the edge of the Kisham Trail, prosperous by frontier standards, with a main street of wooden storefronts, a hotel, 2 saloons, a general store, a smithy, a church, and a schoolhouse that sat at the eastern edge of town like a period at the end of a sentence. It was a growing town, ambitious, the kind of place that built a school before it built a courthouse, and considered that a point of pride. Daniel arrived on a Tuesday and intended to leave on Wednesday. He needed shoes for patients. One shoe had been pulled loose on the road from Medicine Lodge, and perhaps a meal that did not come from his own cooking over a fire in the snow. He had no plans to stay longer than that. He was at the smithy waiting for the farrier when he first heard Theresa Barrett's name. "She's going to get herself killed one of these winters," the smithy, a large and pleasant man named Otto Werner, was saying to no one in particular as he worked the bellows. "Stays in that schoolhouse until all hours. No husband, no family within 300 miles, just her and those books." "Who?" Daniel asked, not because he was particularly curious, but because silence in a smithy made a man feel invisible. Otto looked at him with the measuring gaze of a man assessing a stranger. "Schoolteacher," he said. "Miss Barrett, came out from Philadelphia 3 years ago. Runs the school alone, teaches every grade from primer to 8th. He paused, pumping the bellows. "Brilliant woman, probably the most educated person in 4 counties. Also," he added, as though this were the relevant conclusion, "completely stubborn as a mule and twice as likely to bite." Daniel found this combination of qualities interesting but not immediately relevant to his life. He had his horse shod, ate a meal at the hotel's dining room, and went to sleep in a rented room, planning to leave at first light. The weather had been cloudy when he arrived, the November sky that flat and featureless gray that preceded snow in Kansas, but he had ridden through worse, and his internal compass told him he had a day before anything serious fell. His internal compass was wrong by approximately 12 hours. He woke at 2 in the morning to the sound that every frontier traveler dreaded, that particular low howl of a wind that had made up its mind. He lay in the dark hotel room listening to it tighten from bad to serious to dangerous, and he thought about patients in the hotel stable, and he thought about the road west that he had planned to take at dawn, and he did a calculation that came out clearly in favor of staying exactly where he was. But then, sometime after he had returned to something approaching sleep, he heard a crash from the direction of the street, followed by what sounded like someone cursing with great inventiveness and intelligence in the darkness below his window. He went to look. In the street below, in the beginning of what was going to be an absolutely catastrophic blizzard, a woman in a heavy wool coat was trying to retrieve what appeared to be an armload of books that had cascaded from under her arm when she slipped on the frozen boardwalk. The wind had already scattered several volumes into the growing snow. She was on her knees in the dark, reaching under the boardwalk for a volume that had slid beneath the edge, and she was saying very specific things about the weather, about the architectural design of boardwalks, and about the general relationship between probability and misfortune that struck Daniel as simultaneously furious and remarkably precise. He went downstairs. He did not think about why. He simply went. By the time he reached the street, she had recovered most of the books and was standing upright again, a stack of them clutched to her chest with both arms, her dark hair coming loose from its pins and whipping across her face in the wind. She was tall for a woman, with a quality of stillness at the center of her that the wind could not quite dislodge, and even in the darkness and the beginning snow Daniel could see that her face was arresting, strong-boned, expressive, the kind of face that made you want to look at it more carefully. She looked at him with absolutely no indication of gratitude for his arrival. "I have them," she said. "I can see that," Daniel said. They looked at each other for a moment across the wind. "There are 2 more under the walk," he said. She glanced down. "I know, I can see them. You can't reach them from this angle. I am aware." He got down on one knee in the snow and reached under the boardwalk and retrieved both books without further discussion. He stood and held them out. She looked at the books, then at him, then took them with the air of someone accepting the return of property that had never truly been in dispute. "Thank you," she said. It was perfectly polite and contained no warmth whatsoever. "You're going to walk home in this," he said. It was not a question because it was obvious. "I live at the schoolhouse," she said. "It's 400 yards east. It's going to be a full blizzard inside an hour. I have managed Kansas winters before," she said. "Good night." She turned and walked east into the beginning storm. Daniel stood on the boardwalk and watched until he could not see her any more, which was considerably sooner than he was comfortable with. And then he went back inside and lay on his bed, and told himself that she was a grown woman who knew her own business, and he was a drifter who would be gone at first light, and none of this was any concern of his. He believed this for approximately 40 minutes. Then the storm turned from serious to catastrophic, the kind of blizzard that in Kansas in November could drop 3 feet of snow in 8 hours and reduce visibility to nothing at 15 feet, and Daniel Mercer got up, put on every layer he owned, and went out into it. He would tell himself later, many times, in the retelling that became part of how he understood his own life, that he had gone simply because it was the right thing to do, that any decent man would have done the same. And this was true as far as it went. But the fuller truth was that he had lain in the dark listening to the storm intensify, and thought about a woman walking alone into it with an armload of books and a quality of absolute self-possession that somehow made the idea of her being in danger worse rather than better. And the thought had made something in his chest tight in a way he did not have a name for yet. He found the main street. He oriented himself east by the dim shape of the hotel behind him and the memory of the road's direction. He walked. The storm by this point was extraordinary. The wind came in waves, each one trying to knock him sideways, and the snow had that particular quality of very fine, very fast particles that got into every gap in clothing and reduced visibility to something between 2 and 5 feet, depending on the wind's direction at any given moment. He had walked perhaps 200 yards east when he realized that he had drifted off the road. The ground under the snow had gone from packed earth to something softer that he could feel through his boots, and that he had absolutely no idea which direction he was facing. He stopped. Turning in a blizzard when you had lost your bearings was a way to make things worse. He needed to wait for a lull, get his bearings, and then move deliberately. He crouched with his back to the worst of the wind and tried to think clearly. He could not feel his hands. He thought about Theresa Barrett's books, scattered in the snow. He thought about the way she had said, "I have managed Kansas winters before," as though the winter were a student who had gotten above himself and needed bringing back to order. He thought about the 400 yards between the hotel and the schoolhouse and what 400 yards in this storm could mean. And then he saw the light. 3 slow arcs to the left, 2 sharp swings straight down, 3 slow arcs to the left. He had not imagined it. It was there through the snow, dim and dancing, but absolutely intentional. A signal. Someone was signaling. Not waving signaling with pattern and purpose and knowledge of what signals meant. He moved toward it. The rest he already knew. The door, the warmth, the woman with the bare flame on a wick and the dark eyes full of certainty. He collapsed inside the threshold and did not quite lose consciousness but came very close, and when his vision steadied there was firelight and the schoolhouse around him and Theresa Barrett on one knee beside him with 2 fingers pressed to his wrist, counting his pulse with professional calm. "You're severely chilled but not frostbitten," she said. "Yet. Your hands are the worst of it. Don't put them near the stove directly." "How do you know that?" he managed. "I was trained as a nurse before I became a teacher," she said. "Hold still." She worked quickly and without fuss. She pulled his frozen coat from his shoulders. This required significant effort on her part and no cooperation from him, as his arms were not taking instructions. And she wrapped blankets around him from a chest near the wall, and she pushed a tin cup of something hot into his hands with explicit instructions not to grip it hard, because his circulation needed to restore itself slowly. And he sat on the floor of the schoolhouse with his back against the wall nearest the stove, and drank what turned out to be strong tea laced with something that tasted like whiskey. And he let himself be managed by Theresa Barrett, which was the most surprising thing that had happened to him in a very long time. The schoolhouse was a single room, longer than wide, with 6 rows of desks arranged in careful order, and a large chalkboard at the front covered in mathematical equations that he could read from where he sat. Not simple arithmetic, something with notation he did not recognize. Along the east wall were bookshelves, floor to ceiling, crammed with volumes that ranged from the obvious primers, readers, geography texts, to things that had no business being in an elementary schoolhouse in Caldwell, Kansas. He could see from where he sat a treatise on astronomy, 2 volumes of classical philosophy, something in what appeared to be German, and a medical text that was bookmarked near the middle. "You signaled me," he said. "You knew I was out there." Theresa was hanging his coat on a hook near the stove, turning it to dry. She did not look at him. "I saw you leave the hotel," she said. "I watched from my window. You came out approximately 40 minutes after I arrived, which told me you had tried to convince yourself not to and failed." He stared at her. "You watched for me." "I calculated that a man who came out in the beginning of a storm to retrieve my books was probably the type of man who would do something even more reckless when the storm worsened," she said. She turned and looked at him directly. There was no apology in her expression, no embarrassment. "I was prepared to signal because I had assessed the probability, and it was not negligible." "You assessed the probability," he repeated slowly. "Yes." She pulled a chair from the nearest student's desk and sat down in it backwards, arms resting on the back, looking at him. "You're warm enough for conversation. I'm getting there. Good, because I want to know why you came out." The directness of it caught him sideways. He had spent his adult life in the company of men who communicated in ellipsis and implication and never asked the actual question. He had forgotten that people could simply say the thing they meant. "Same reason I came down to the street," he said. "It seemed like the right thing. For a stranger. You didn't seem like you needed help." "I didn't," she agreed. "I know the way to my own door. I have walked it in bad weather many times." "But you might have needed it," he said. Something shifted in her expression. Not softness, exactly. He had the sense that Theresa Barrett's face did not do softness as a primary mode, but something like a recalibration, as though she was adjusting a calculation to include new information. "Yes," she said. "I might have." The storm raged all night. They could hear it against the walls and the roof, a sustained assault that occasionally built to screaming intensity and then dropped back to merely ferocious. The stove kept the room at a survivable temperature. Daniel's circulation restored itself slowly and painfully, that particular deep ache of blood returning to frozen extremities that he knew from experience was actually a good sign, though it did not feel like one. Theresa made more tea and eventually, from a small back room that apparently served as a storage and living space, produced bread and hard cheese and a jar of preserves that she set out on the teacher's desk. They talked. Daniel had not talked with real ease in a very long time. He had talked at people, at saloon companions, at cattle hands, at the various transactional figures of frontier life, but not with anyone. Theresa Barrett talked with him, asking questions that were specific rather than polite, and listening to the answers with her full attention in a way that made him feel, for the first time in years, that his answers mattered. He told her about Missouri and the farm and the war that had come when he was too young for it. He told her about the cattle drives and the years of drifting and the sense of displacement that he had come to accept as simply the shape of his life. She listened without pity, which he was grateful for, because pity would have made him close up immediately. In return, she told him about Philadelphia, and about the family that had expected her to marry at 20, and instead found her at 22 enrolled in the only nursing training program in the city that accepted women, and at 25, presenting her credentials to the Kansas School Board, who had been skeptical of her age and considerably more skeptical of the fact that her qualifications exceeded those of any of the male candidates by a significant margin. "They asked me to demonstrate competency," she said, with a quality in her voice that was somewhere between amusement and sharp memory. "I taught a sample lesson, third-grade reading. The board member who questioned my credentials most loudly had a son in that class as it happened, and the boy had been struggling with a reading difficulty that 3 previous teachers had failed to diagnose. I identified it in the first lesson and prescribed an approach. The boy was reading at grade level within 6 weeks. What did the board member say? He voted for my appointment," she said. "He did not apologize for the questioning. Men rarely do." She said this not with bitterness but with the tone of someone documenting a factual pattern. "No," Daniel agreed. "We don't." She looked at him with something that might have been the beginning of appreciation. "You admit it." Seems foolish to argue against evidence. The fire settled in the stove. Outside, the blizzard continued its testimony. "You were going to leave tomorrow," she said. It was not a question. "Yes." "Where?" He had to think about this. "West," he said finally. "Colorado, maybe. I've heard there's work there." "There's work everywhere," she said. "That's not a destination, that's a direction." He looked at her. "I'm not trying to be unkind," she said. "It's an observation. I have made the same mistake. When I came west, I told myself I was going toward something, toward a frontier that needed teachers, toward a place where my qualifications would matter more than my gender. And those things were true. But I was also running from a life in Philadelphia that had been arranged for me without my input, and I didn't face that honestly until I had been here for 2 years. She paused. "What are you running from?" The directness of the question should have made him defensive. Instead, it made him feel something like relief, the way a man felt when he set down a weight he had been carrying so long he had forgotten it was there. "Nothing specific," he said slowly. "I think I'm running from the fact of having nothing specific." She considered this for a long moment. "That is a much more honest answer than I expected." "You expected dishonesty." "I expected deflection," she said. "Most men deflect. I've been cold enough tonight that I don't have the energy for deflection." She smiled. It transformed her face entirely, not softening it, exactly, but illuminating it, the way light illuminated a landscape without changing the landscape's essential character. It was the first time she had smiled at him, and it hit him somewhere behind the sternum with a force that was completely out of proportion to the occasion. He looked away at the chalkboard so she would not see whatever was happening on his face. "What are those equations?" he asked. She looked at the board. "Celestial navigation calculations," she said, without any particular emphasis. He looked at her. "You're teaching celestial navigation to children, to the older students, the 8th graders." She stood and walked to the board, picking up a piece of chalk. "The standard curriculum does not include it, but the standard curriculum was designed by people who did not consider that children on the frontier might need to navigate by stars. The nearest doctor is 40 miles. The nearest town of any size is 60. If a child grows up to be a rancher or a farmer or a freighter and gets lost on the plains, knowing how to find north by Polaris could be the difference between life and getting lost in a snowstorm at midnight." She said the last 6 words with a pointed look in his direction. He felt warmth rise in his face that had nothing to do with the stove. "You're making a point." "Several," she said. She set down the chalk. "I believe in practical education. I believe in teaching children not just what the textbooks say, but what the world actually requires of them. The world of 1878 in Kansas requires self-sufficiency and navigation and basic medicine, and the ability to read weather and terrain. I teach all of it." He stared at the equations on the board. He could follow the basic logic of them. He was not uneducated, whatever his drifting life might suggest, but they were complex, integrating astronomical data and spherical geometry in ways that he had never seen laid out so clearly. "You wrote all that from memory?" he asked. "I wrote it this afternoon while preparing tomorrow's lesson," she said. "Which will not happen tomorrow given the storm, but preparation is preparation regardless." He looked at her for a long moment. "You are," he said carefully, trying to find the right word, "extraordinary." She did not flinch away from the word or deflect it with false modesty. She simply held his gaze. "I know what I am capable of," she said. "I have had to because no one else was going to tell me." They slept in the end, not from comfort but from exhaustion. Theresa gave him 2 blankets and kept the stove stoked through the night, checking on it at intervals in a way he only half registered, half dreaming, half aware of the room around him. He woke once to find her sitting at the teacher's desk in the gray pre-dawn dark with a book open and a candle lit, reading with the absolute absorption of someone for whom the act of reading was as natural as breathing. And he lay still watching her for a moment that felt, even as he was experiencing it, like something he was going to carry for a very long time. By morning, the storm had lessened from catastrophic to merely brutal. The snow was 3 feet deep in the drifts, and the temperature had dropped to something that made the air feel solid. The road west was, for the foreseeable future, impassable. Daniel was not going anywhere. Otto Werner found his way to the schoolhouse by mid-morning to check on Theresa. This was, Daniel gathered, a standing agreement between them, a community's way of accounting for its most isolated member, and he found Daniel there and widened his eyes in the specific way of a man who has developed an extensive internal theory about 2 people within 15 seconds. "Good," Otto said firmly, to no one in particular, and went home. The town of Caldwell had a way of knowing its own business that was typical of small frontier settlements: comprehensive, rapid, and only intermittently accurate. By noon on the day after the blizzard, it was commonly understood that the drifter from the hotel had spent the night in the schoolhouse. Opinions on this fact were divided along lines that roughly corresponded to people's opinions of Theresa Barrett, which were themselves divided along lines that corresponded to whether a given person felt that a woman who ran her own school, taught celestial navigation, and refused to defer to the county school board's suggestions about curriculum was admirable or unsettling. Theresa received 3 visitors that afternoon, all women, all of whom arrived under the pretext of checking on her welfare and departed with information. She dealt with each of them with the patient courtesy of someone who had long since understood that a woman alone on the frontier was a subject of community concern regardless of her preferences. Daniel spent the afternoon in the schoolhouse doing what his hands were naturally good at. The woodbin was low, and he split wood for 3 hours in the cold behind the building. The back door had a gap at the bottom that had been letting cold air in all winter, and he spent an hour on that with spare lumber and tools from the storage room. There was a shutter on the north window that hung at the wrong angle and banged in the wind, and he fixed that too. Theresa came out at one point and watched him work on the shutter for a moment. "You don't have to do that," she said. "I know," he said. She watched a moment longer. "The gap under the back door has been bothering me since September," she said. "I've asked the school board twice for the repair. Board said no. Board said they would put it on the list." The quality in her voice conveyed exactly what she thought of the list. He kept working. She went back inside. The thing he had not planned for, the thing that caught him entirely off guard, happened on the 3rd day, when the road was clear enough for travel but Daniel had not left. He told himself it was because patients needed another day to recover from the storm. He told himself it was because there was more work to do at the schoolhouse. He told himself various practical things, and none of them were entirely false, and none of them were entirely the point. The point was that on the 3rd day, he found himself sitting in the back of the classroom watching Theresa Barrett teach. She had 6 students whose parents had managed to get them through the snow. a small and hardy group ranging from 9 to 14 years old, and she taught them with an intensity and precision that he found genuinely startling. Not because he had not expected her to be good at it, but because the teaching itself was nothing like what he had understood teaching to be. She did not stand at the front and recite. She moved through the room, asking questions, pushing back on wrong answers with specific challenges rather than corrections, drawing connections between arithmetic and navigation, and the reading lesson in ways that seemed effortless but that he recognized, watching carefully, were deeply planned. She was teaching the older students, 3 of them, ages 12 and 14, to use a basic sextant. An actual sextant, brass and glass, that she handled with the practiced ease of someone who had used one extensively. Daniel had seen sextants on cattle drives, in the hands of professional surveyors and occasionally ambitious trail bosses. He had a general understanding of the principle, using the angle of celestial bodies to determine position. He did not know how to use one himself. Theresa Barrett was teaching 14-year-olds how to do it. She set up a scenario on the chalkboard: hypothetical position on the prairie, known date and time, visible stars, and walked them through the calculation step by step. And then she handed the sextant to a boy named Thomas, who was the eldest, and had him take a measurement through the north window at a fixed star that was visible even in the pale afternoon sky. Thomas got the measurement wrong by a significant margin. Theresa did not tell him he was wrong. She asked him 3 questions in sequence that caused him to identify his own error, correct his own measurement, and redo the calculation. When the corrected answer came out within acceptable range of the right answer, the boy's face went through something that Daniel recognized from his own life, the specific joy of understanding something that had seemed impossible. "Good," Theresa said. "Now tell me what that position tells us about which direction to walk to reach the nearest settlement." Daniel watched this from the back of the room and felt something shift in his chest. It was not the attraction, though that was present and had been since the first moment in the street. This was something different. This was respect, deep and uncomplicated, for a person who was genuinely extraordinary at something that mattered, and the recognition that he had spent years in the company of people he respected for their strength or their courage or their reliability, and had never met anyone he simply admired with this particular quality of admiration. He was still sitting there when the students left at afternoon's end, and Theresa turned from the chalkboard to find him looking at her. "You have been very quiet for 2 hours," she said. "I've been watching you teach." She leaned the chalk against the board tray. "And where did you learn to use a sextant?" Something flickered in her expression, not quite pride, but something adjacent to it, the thing a person felt when asked about the thing they had worked hardest for. "My father was a naval surveyor," she said. "He taught me to use one before I was 12, which scandalized my mother considerably. I spent 2 years after my nursing training studying surveying methodology at the Philadelphia Academy of Sciences. I was not allowed to matriculate officially, but I sat in on every lecture they would permit and read everything in the library." She paused. "I intended to survey the Western Territories. The survey offices did not employ women, so I became a teacher and I teach what I know." Daniel stared at her. He was aware that he was staring. He did not correct it. "You could survey the territories," he said. "That's not a question of education or skill or I am aware of what I am capable of," she said, and there was something in her voice now that was not quite pain but carried the shape of old injury. "What you are describing is a question of what I am permitted, which is a different matter." He sat with this for a moment. "That is unjust," he said. She looked at him with an expression he could not fully read. "Yes," she said, "it is." She picked up an eraser and began to clear the chalkboard. "I appreciate that you see it that way." "I'm not saying it to be generous," he said. "I'm saying it because it's true. Those calculations on the board, I've seen surveyors work. I know what that represents. You should be running expeditions, not running a schoolroom in Caldwell, Kansas." She set down the eraser and turned to face him, Her expression had gone direct and clear. "This is what I chose, Daniel. Not because I had no other options, but because this," she gestured at the room, at the desks, at the cleared chalkboard, "this is where it matters. A surveyor charts territory. A teacher changes what people are capable of seeing. Thomas will know, for the rest of his life, how to find his position by the stars. That is not a small thing." He looked at her across the rows of empty student desks and understood something about her that he had not understood before, that her decision to be here was not a compromise. It was a choice made with full knowledge, and the knowledge included the injustice of it, and she had made it anyway because she had identified what she valued most and placed herself in service of it. He was, quite completely, lost. Not in the way he had been lost in the blizzard. That had been a physical fact, a temporary condition with a solution. This was something more fundamental, the specific disorientation of a man who has spent years certain that he wanted nothing in particular, and has suddenly encountered something he wants very specifically. He said none of this. He was not yet at a point where he could say it. Instead, he stood and picked up the eraser she had set down and continued clearing the chalkboard, and she watched him for a moment with an expression he was learning to read. And then she went to stoke the stove, and they worked in comfortable silence until the last of the equations were gone. The days that followed were a negotiation, not awkward, not tentative, but the specific and careful negotiation of two people who were both intelligent enough to know what was happening between them and cautious enough not to say it prematurely. Daniel did not leave. He moved from the hotel to a small room above the general store that cost considerably less per week, and began taking on work around town in exchange for room and board. He split wood for 3 families on the north edge of town. He helped Otto Werner repair the Smithy's bellows mechanism, which had been failing for 2 months. He rewired the school's one window shutter, which had broken again in the wind, and while he was there, he repaired 2 desk legs that had been wobbling for a semester, and replaced the warped floorboard near the front door that Theresa had to step around every morning. He stopped by the schoolhouse most evenings, ostensibly to check on whatever repair he had most recently completed. Theresa let this fiction stand for exactly 3 days, and then called him on it with characteristic directness. "You are not checking on the floorboard," she said, on the 4th evening without looking up from the composition she was grading. "No," he agreed. "Then why are you here?" He sat down in the teacher's chair across from her desk, which she had pulled around to sit beside rather than behind so that she could spread papers across the full surface. "Because I like it here," he said. She set down her grading pen and looked at him. "Daniel." "Yes." "What do you intend?" The question was precise, and he understood it precisely. What did he intend toward her, toward this town, toward the life he had been living that was not quite working? What did he intend with the evenings in the schoolhouse and the repairs and the growing comfort of her company? "I don't know yet," he said honestly. "I know what I don't intend, which is to leave." She held his gaze for a long moment with those dark, direct eyes. "That is," she said finally, "more honest than most declarations I have received." "Have you received many declarations?" "3, she said. "All from men who believed that a woman alone on the frontier must be desperate for rescue. None of them particularly interested in who I actually was." She picked up her pen again. "You ask questions and listen to the answers, which puts you in a different category." He sat with the warmth of this for a moment. "There's something I've been thinking about," he said. She kept grading, but she was listening. He had learned that her listening did not always look like listening. "I've been drifting for 9 years," he said. "I've been good at a lot of things and settled at nothing. I've told myself that the frontier requires that kind of man, the type who can do whatever needs doing and move when it's done. But I think the truth is I never found a place that made me want to stop." The pen stopped moving on the paper. "I think Caldwell might be that place," he said carefully. She looked up. "I think," he said even more carefully, "that you might be why." Theresa Barrett did not cry. She did not reach for his hand. She did not say something soft and yielding. She looked at him with that direct, clear gaze and said, I have been let down before by men who said they were staying and did not stay. I know. I am not easy to live alongside, she said. I have strong opinions about a very large number of things, and I do not conceal them. I do not keep regular hours. I teach myself new mathematics for amusement. I am not interested in being a pretty arrangement in someone's house. I know that too, he said. All of those things are reasons I'm still here. She looked at him for a very long time. Then she said, I need you to prove it. How? Stay the winter, she said. Spring on the frontier is different from winter. If you are still here in April and still feel what you say you feel, tell me again. He nodded slowly. That's fair. It's not about being fair, she said. It's about not making a mistake that I can't undo. She returned to her grading. You may keep coming by in the evenings if you like. I like, he said. He stayed. The winter of 1878 into 1879 in Caldwell, Kansas was long and full of weather, and full of Daniel Mercer making himself useful, in ways that a man with his particular combination of skills and restlessness and newly focused attention could make himself useful on a frontier. He found a steady position with a local rancher named Harlan Cox, mending fences and managing horses, and doing the 100 physical tasks that a working cattle operation required in the off-season. The work was honest and physical and paid reliably, and it gave him a legitimate stake in the community, and something to be in addition to the drifter who had stumbled into town during a blizzard and stayed. He and Theresa developed a rhythm. Evenings in the schoolhouse, talking while she graded or prepared lessons. Sunday afternoons when the weather permitted, walking the edge of town, an activity that was perfectly respectable and that the town of Caldwell watched with great interest. She began to teach him celestial navigation. This was her idea, not his, presented one evening with a matter-of-factness that did not conceal how much it meant to her, the sharing of the thing she valued most. He was a quick student. He had good spatial intelligence and the patience to work through calculations more than once until they were right. She was a rigorous teacher, not gentle about errors but precise about them, pointing to the exact place a calculation had gone wrong with the same calm specificity she brought to her students' work. One evening in December, she set him a navigation problem, a hypothetical position, known stars, specific time, and went to the storage room to get more tea while he worked through it. He worked carefully, double-checking his calculations, arriving at a position that he then used to calculate the bearing to the nearest settlement. She came back with the tea and looked at his work. She went very still. What? He asked. You're right, she said. She set down the tea. She picked up the paper with his calculations and looked at it more carefully. You're entirely right, and you did it without the intermediate step I showed you. I found a shorter route to it, he said. Through the angular relationship. Is that? It's exactly right, she said. She looked at him with an expression he had not seen on her face before. Not quite surprised, Theresa Barrett did not surprise easily, but something close to it. A recalibration, and this time the recalibration was running in a direction that made something in her eyes very bright. Daniel, that is a valid simplification of the calculation, one that I have not seen written anywhere. That is, she stopped. Is it wrong? He asked. No, she said. It is not wrong, it is elegant. She set the paper down. She sat down in her chair. She looked at him across the teacher's desk. Where did you go to school? One-room schoolhouse in Missouri until I was 12, he said. No formal education after. You invented a simplification of a celestial navigation calculation with 12 years of formal schooling and no higher mathematics, she said. He felt self-conscious under this scrutiny. I just followed the relationship between the angles, he said. It seemed like the direct path was. That is how mathematical discovery works, she said. Her voice had gone soft in a way he had not heard from her before. Soft and also warm and also something that sat very close to what love sounded like when it was being recognized rather than declared. You have a mathematical mind that you have never been given the opportunity to develop. You could have been, she stopped herself. A drifter works fine, he said lightly. It does not work fine, she said with sudden fierceness. It is a waste. And I am, she added more quietly, furious on your behalf at a world that gave me a father who taught me to use a sextant and gave you a war that took your farm before you had a chance. He looked at her. Theresa. Yes. I think I love you, he said. The words came out with a simplicity that surprised him, not tentative, not decorated, just the fact of the thing, stated as directly as she had always been direct with him, because it seemed like the only fitting mode. She looked at him for a long moment. The fire crackled in the stove. Outside, the December wind moved around the schoolhouse walls with that low note that meant cold but not storm. I think, she said slowly, that I love you too. A pause. I have been thinking it for some weeks and not saying it because I was not yet certain you would stay. And now, you have been here 6 weeks, she said. And you have fixed every broken thing in this schoolhouse and learned to calculate stellar positions and spent your Sunday afternoons walking in the cold with me, and you are still here. She folded her hands on the desk with the precision of someone reaching a conclusion. I believe you will stay. He reached across the desk and covered her folded hands with his. She looked down at his hand, then up at him, and the smile she gave him was nothing like the polite, public smile she gave the town. This one reached everything, and it was entirely for him. I will stay, he said. Winter deepened, and their love deepened with it, steadily and without drama, the way the best things grew, not in a single magnificent moment, but in accumulated days of specific, known, chosen presence. He knew the way she held her pen when she was thinking through a problem. She knew the sound of his boots on the schoolhouse step, and could tell from the rhythm of them whether he had had a difficult day or an easy one. He brought her a new lantern chimney in December to replace the one she had broken signaling him through the blizzard, and she kept both the bare frame of the original and the new glass one, on the windowsill side by side, which he only realized weeks later, and which meant something to him that he could not quite put into words. He told her about the things he had been carrying. Not in one great outpouring, but in pieces, over evenings, the way you unpacked a trunk one item at a time, examining each one before setting it down. The farm and the war and the years of wandering and the slow erosion of purpose that came from a life without destination. She listened with the full attention she gave everything, and she did not offer remedies or reassurances. She simply received it, the way good listeners received things completely, without judgment. She told him about Philadelphia, about the life that had been arranged for her and the effort it had taken to refuse it. About the nursing training and the years of being the only woman in rooms full of men who had collectively decided that her presence was an anomaly to be tolerated rather than a fact to be adjusted to. About the particular loneliness of being intelligent in a world that had not built any structures for women to apply their intelligence in. Did you ever regret coming west? He asked. Never, she said without hesitation. I regret specific things. I regret that the school board controls my curriculum. I regret that I cannot survey. I regret that there was no one here for 3 years who, she stopped. Who what? Who treated my mind as a gift rather than an inconvenience, she said quietly. He squeezed her hand. I will never treat your mind as an inconvenience. I know, she said. That is rather the central fact of this. Christmas in Caldwell was a community event, a pageant at the church, and a gathering afterward in the hotel dining room. The entire small population of the town assembled in the warmth against the cold outside. Theresa attended with Daniel, which was new, and which the town registered with the particular satisfaction of a community that had been wanting something to happen and has finally seen it happen. Clara Werner, Otto's wife, a broad and warm woman who had appointed herself the town's emotional infrastructure, pulled Daniel aside near the stove with an expression of considerable intensity. You are good for her, Clara said. And I say this as someone who has been worrying about that woman for 3 years. She is too bright and too alone, and she does too much by herself, and she needed, Clara stopped, appearing to reconsider the speech she had prepared. She needed an equal, she said finally. Not a protector, an equal. Daniel looked across the room to where Theresa was engaged in explaining something to the minister's wife with the characteristic combination of precision and patience that was her public mode. She caught his eye across the room and something passed between them, quick, private, completely theirs. "I understand that," he said. January brought a crisis, as Kansas Januaries tended to do, though not of the weather variety. A man arrived in Caldwell, a man named Preston Ford, who had, from the way the town reacted to his arrival, some history with the place. He was well dressed for the frontier, a land agent, the kind of man who moved through western settlements with paperwork and smooth speech, and a practiced talent for making legal maneuvers look like opportunity. He went to the schoolhouse. Daniel, who was at the smithy when he passed, saw him go and felt something uncomfortable move through him that he identified, after a moment's honest assessment, as jealousy that was dressed up as concern. He left the smithy and followed. He arrived at the schoolhouse to find Theresa standing at her desk, with an expression he had not seen on her face before, controlled fury, the specific kind that came from a threat that required a careful response. Preston Ford stood on the other side of the desk looking pleased with himself, holding a paper that Theresa had apparently just read. Daniel stopped in the doorway. Theresa looked at him without surprise. "Daniel," she said, "Mr. Ford is here with a notice from the county school board. They are proposing to consolidate the Caldwell school with the school in Wellington to the north, which would require closing this building and relocating the students." Daniel looked at Preston Ford, who was the type of man whose pleasedness with himself increased in direct proportion to the discomfort he caused. "On what grounds?" Daniel asked. "Efficiency," Ford said smoothly. "The board's view is that a single larger school is more cost-effective than two smaller ones. The Caldwell enrollment has remained below 20 for 3 years. The Caldwell enrollment is below 20 because half the families on the east side of the county are not yet settled enough to send children regularly," Theresa said. Her voice was completely controlled, which Daniel had learned was a sign of depth of feeling rather than absence of it. "Wellington is 40 miles north. My students cannot travel 40 miles in Kansas winter conditions. The board has considered that," Ford said. "There is a proposal to provide board and lodging for the winter months." "You want to remove children from their families for 4 months in the winter," Theresa said. "You are presenting this as efficiency." Ford's pleasedness began to show signs of strain. "Miss Barrett, the board's decision is within its authority. The board's authority is bounded by the welfare of the students," Theresa said. She reached under her desk and withdrew a document that Daniel could see was covered in her precise handwriting. "I have anticipated this conversation, as I anticipated that it would happen when the board's January meeting produced no response to my October report on enrollment projections. I have prepared a counterproposal." Ford blinked. "A counterproposal?" "An enrollment projection for the next 3 years. Based on census data for the eastern county settlements and the known rate of family settlement in this territory, which indicates that Caldwell's enrollment will reach 35 by 1881 if current trends continue." She set the document on the desk. "I have also prepared an economic analysis demonstrating that the cost of boarding Wellington consolidated students in Wellington for 4 winter months exceeds the cost of maintaining the Caldwell School for 5 years. And I have written letters which I would ask you to deliver to the board, from the parents of 14 of my current students attesting to the impossibility of a Wellington arrangement for their families." Ford stared at the document. He picked it up. He began to read it. His expression over the next 2 minutes of reading moved through a sequence of stages that ended at something resembling resignation. "I will present this to the board," he said finally. "You will," Theresa agreed. Ford left. Daniel stood in the doorway looking at Theresa, who sat down in her chair with the precise care of someone who had been holding herself very straight for a long time and was now allowing herself to settle. "You had that ready," he said. "Since October," she said. "I knew this was coming. Land agents have been circling the county since last summer. The school building sits on a half-acre lot that someone wants for something. You wrote letters to 14 families. 17 families, she said. 14 responded. He crossed the room and sat in the nearest student desk, which was somewhat too small for him, and looked at her. "Theresa," he said, "how do you manage all of this alone?" She looked at him. "I have been managing alone because there was no other option. It is not the preferred state. It is simply what was available." A pause. "It is different now." "Yes," he said, "it is." The board reviewed her counter-proposal. 3 weeks later, a letter arrived informing Miss Barrett that the consolidation proposal had been tabled pending a reevaluation of county enrollment projections. The school remained open. Caldwell watched this outcome with enormous satisfaction, because Caldwell, whatever its complicated feelings about Theresa Barrett's independence and her unusual curriculum and her refusal to be managed, was deeply proud of her. February moved into March, and March made its familiar offer of thaw and promise, and the first tentative signs of green at the edges of the prairie. Daniel's work at the Cox Ranch shifted from maintenance to the beginning of spring preparation, and he found himself thinking, with an entirely new quality of thought, about what the next year looked like, and the year after that. He had been thinking in seasons for so long that thinking in years felt like a radical act. He spoke to Otto Werner first, because Otto was the closest thing he had to a confidant in Caldwell, and because Otto had a quality of direct good sense that Daniel valued. "I'm thinking of asking Theresa to marry me," he said. They were in the smithy, Otto working, Daniel keeping company. Otto set down his hammer and looked at him with an expression of deep personal satisfaction. "I have been waiting for you to say that since December," Otto said. "What took you so long?" "She asked me to prove I was staying," Daniel said. "I was proving it." Otto picked up his hammer again. "She is going to say yes," he said, "and she is going to make you work for it. I'm counting on both of those things." He asked her on a Sunday afternoon in March, when the prairie east of town was showing the first pale gold green of spring growth, and the sky was the particular clear blue that followed winter in Kansas, wide and clean and impossibly large. They had walked to a rise east of town that Theresa had shown him in January as the best vantage point for stargazing, and they were standing on it looking at the sky coming on toward evening. He did not have a ring. He had thought about this and decided that presenting her with a ring before asking felt like presumption, like deciding the answer before the question. He would get the ring after. "I want to ask you something," he said. "I suspected," she said. She was looking at the horizon where the sky was going gold and rose. "When you suggested a walk to the East Rise rather than the main street, I suspected. Am I that predictable?" "You are consistent," she said, with a quality that was not quite a smile but was everything adjacent to one. "There is a difference." He turned to face her fully. She turned to face him. The light was catching the edges of her dark hair and the strong lines of her face, and she was looking at him with those clear, direct eyes that had never given him anything but honesty. "I came to Caldwell in November without a direction or a destination," he said. "I was going to stay for one day. I have stayed for 4 months, and in those 4 months I have found the first thing in my adult life that I did not want to move away from. That thing is you. Your mind and your stubbornness and your mathematics and the way you grade compositions at midnight and the fact that you signaled me out of a blizzard with a broken lantern because you had calculated that I would do something reckless." He paused. "I love all of it. I love you." She was perfectly still. "I want to stay," he said. "Not as the drifter who stopped, but as someone who chose. I want to be here for the things that happen next, for this school and for you. I want to learn more of your mathematics and fix things that are broken and be the person who knows the sound of your boots on the floor when you are working late." He took a breath. "Theresa, will you marry me?" She looked at him for a long time. The prairie light moved around them. Far away across the grass, a meadowlark made its sound. "Yes," she said. It was simple and complete and entirely like her. He reached for her hands and she gave them, both of them, and he held them and looked at her face and saw, running just beneath the surface of the controlled intelligence and the precision and the fierce independence, something that was entirely new, absolute happiness. She did not hide it. She did not modulate it. For a moment she simply let it be there on her face between them, real and undefended. He kissed her then, for the first time, just briefly, just once, but with everything he had, and she kissed him back with the specific, decisive quality she brought to everything she did, as though she had made the calculation and found the answer and was committing to it fully. They were married in April of 1879 in the Caldwell church, which was the only building in town large enough to hold everyone who insisted on attending, which turned out to be essentially everyone. Theresa wore a dress that Clara Werner had helped her make deep blue wool, not white, because Theresa had specific opinions about the symbolism of colors and white was not among her preferences. She wore her dark hair up with a precision that had required Clara's assistance and her own patience, both of which had been somewhat tested. The ceremony was simple and brief, because Theresa had been firm with the minister about length, and had made the same case for efficiency in ceremonial language that she made for efficiency in mathematical notation. The vows were the traditional ones, because Theresa valued precision in language and saw no reason to improve on text that had been refined over centuries. When the minister asked if anyone had objection, the congregation held its collective breath for a genuinely tense moment, because frontier weddings had a history, and then let it out all at once when no objection came. Daniel slid the ring he had ordered from Wichita onto Theresa's hand, a simple gold band, because he had asked her what she wanted, and she had said something that would not catch on chalk or get in the way of a sextant. And she looked at it for a moment with an expression that was the closest thing to wonder he had ever seen on her face. The reception in the hotel dining room went on into the evening, and was remembered in Caldwell for some years afterward as the occasion on which Otto Werner told the story of finding Daniel in the schoolhouse the morning after the blizzard, with a degree of dramatic embellishment that increased each time he told it, and on which Theresa Barrett, Theresa Mercer now, which she used professionally only in conjunction with her own name. As she was specific about this, stood with her husband's arm around her shoulders, and argued philosophy with the minister, and simultaneously managed to eat an entire slice of Clara Werner's wedding cake without pausing in the argument, which Daniel watched with such undisguised admiration that Clara elbowed Otto in the ribs and said, "See, told you," in German. They took a house on the south side of town, 2 rooms with a good stove and a back porch that faced east, which Theresa had specified because she wanted a clear eastern sky for star observation. Daniel repaired and improved everything in it over the first month, and Theresa filled the bookshelves, which Daniel had built to her specifications, floor to ceiling, both long walls of the main room with what turned out to be an extraordinary number of books that had been stored in the school's back room, and that she now liberated with the satisfaction of someone reclaiming rightful property. Their life together had a quality that he had not known to want because he had not known it was possible, the quality of genuine partnership between equals who were unequal in different directions, and who filled each other's gaps not through dependence but through choice. She challenged him constantly, intellectually and practically, and he found that he expanded to meet the challenges. He began sitting in on classes again, this time with the older students, and Theresa began incorporating him into some of the navigation and surveying lessons, first as a student and then, as his understanding deepened, as something more like a teaching assistant. He enrolled in a correspondence course through the University of Kansas. Theresa found it, helped him select the mathematics components, and wrote him a note that said simply, "You should have had this a long time ago," and which he kept in the inside pocket of his coat for months. He also began, quietly, writing to the Kansas State Survey Office. He had an idea practical, rooted in what he knew of the frontier, and what he had learned from Theresa about supplementary surveying work that could be contracted to individuals rather than requiring full expedition teams. He wrote well. Theresa had been editing his letters for the school board situation, and the habit of precision had carried over. His first letter received a polite dismissal. His second, revised with Theresa's input and her specific suggestions about framing the economic argument, received a request for further information. In the fall of 1879, their first fall as husband and wife, Theresa told him she was expecting a child. She told him in the schoolhouse, after the students had gone, with the same directness she brought to everything, but with an undertone of something that was softer than her usual mode. He stood very still for a moment, and then he crossed the room and put his arms around her and held on, and she let him, and she rested her head against his shoulder with a completeness that told him everything about what she felt. They stayed like that for a long time, in the quiet of the schoolhouse where they had begun, while the autumn light came through the north window and lay gold across the rows of student desks. "Are you frightened?" he asked. "Considerably," she said, which was the most honest thing she could have said. "I know the medical realities. I know the risks. I also know that I am healthy and that we have the best possible resources within reach." A pause. "I am also very glad. I am extraordinarily glad," he said. "Good," she said. She straightened and looked at him. "I intend to continue teaching until January. The board will have objections. I have prepared a response." He smiled. "I know you have." Their son was born in March of 1880, which was the same month that the Kansas State Survey Office sent a formal letter of engagement for seasonal contract work, which was Daniel's first contracted survey work. He read the letter at the kitchen table at 7 in the morning, 2 weeks before the baby arrived, and was still sitting there looking at it when Theresa came in for breakfast. She read it over his shoulder. She set her hands on his shoulders and pressed briefly, the gesture she had developed for things that required no words. The baby arrived on a Tuesday. Clara Werner was there, and a doctor who had settled in Caldwell the previous summer, a young man named Dr. Holt who had been trained in St. Louis, and who Theresa had spent considerable time educating about frontier medical realities since his arrival. The birth was long and difficult in the way that births often were in 1880 in Kansas, and Daniel spent most of it in the outer room doing things with his hands, mending, organizing, restoring order to every surface, because there was nothing else useful he could do, and the need to be useful was overwhelming. Clara came out twice with updates. The second time she said it is going well, and Daniel understood from her face that this meant difficult but not dangerous. The third time she came out she was smiling. "A boy," she said, "healthy, good lungs." Daniel went into the bedroom, where Theresa was propped against the pillows with the specific exhaustion of a person who has done something enormous and survived it, and in her arms there was a small and red-faced and emphatically present person who was, Daniel registered with a shock that was both overwhelming and somehow exactly the right size, their son. Theresa looked up at him. She was tired in a way that went deeper than sleep could reach, and her hair was loose and her face was bare of its usual composed certainty, and she was entirely beautiful. "He has your nose," she said. Daniel sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his son. He could not find words for what he felt. He put one careful finger against his son's small fist, and the fist closed around it with the absolute authority of something that had decided, completely and without consultation, that this was where it belonged. They named him James Barrett Mercer James for no particular ancestor, but simply because it was a solid name that felt complete, and Barrett because Theresa was keeping her own name as part of his, which the minister had opinions about, and Theresa received those opinions with the patient attention she gave all feedback before filing it in the category of interesting but irrelevant. The years that followed had the specific quality of a life that was genuinely and fully inhabited. Not without difficulty, frontier life in Kansas in the 1880s was not without difficulty for anyone, but the difficulties were met with partnership, which made them different in kind rather than degree. Daniel's contract survey work grew. He spent seasons in the field, conducting the supplementary surveys that the state office was beginning to understand the value of, and between seasons he came home to Caldwell and James and Theresa, and the homecomings had a warmth that he had never expected to know. He had found, against all the evidence of his first 30 years, that he was a man who wanted a home, very specifically and permanently. Theresa continued to teach, and to fight the school board, and to win the fights, and to gradually, through the accumulated weight of results, shift the board's understanding of what the Caldwell School could be. By 1882, the school had 31 students and a waiting list from Eastern County families. The board approved a second classroom. Theresa hired an assistant, a young woman from Wichita named Miss Cole, who had come highly recommended and who Theresa assessed in a single 2-hour observation and pronounced capable. "She has good instincts," Theresa told Daniel. "She will be better than me in 5 years." "She won't be better than you," he said. "She will be better in some respects," Theresa said, with the precision that never left her. "She is a gifted reader of children's emotional states. I am better with the academic material. Together, we are teaching them more than either of us could alone." She said this with undisguised satisfaction. That is the correct outcome. James Mercer grew in the specific way of children who are raised by people who pay genuine attention curiously, relentlessly, with an early vocabulary that alarmed some of the neighbors and delighted Otto Werner. He was at his mother's knee through equations by the time he was 4, asking questions that Theresa answered completely and without condescension, and he was doing basic celestial navigation calculations, real ones, with her supervision and the brass sextant, by the time he was 9. He also had Daniel's hands, the same spatial intelligence and practical mechanical instinct, and Daniel taught him everything he knew: carpentry, horsemanship, the care and management of tools and animals, and the 100 daily skills of frontier life. The boy moved between these two modes of knowledge with an ease that both his parents found deeply satisfying to watch. In 1883, Daniel's survey work led him to a discovery that had nothing to do with the official survey and everything to do with Theresa. He was working a section of land east of Caldwell territory that he knew well by now, and he found, in a valley that the official maps had marked simply as grassland, a geological formation that told him something the official maps did not know. He made careful notes and took measurements and brought them home. He spread the notes on the kitchen table. Theresa looked at them for 15 minutes without speaking, picking up her pen twice and setting it down again, which was the sign that she was working through something significant. "This is a structural survey finding," she said finally. "This valley has freshwater access and soil composition consistent with high agricultural productivity. This is the kind of land the railroad companies are looking for." "Yes," he said. She looked up at him. "Have you filed this report with the state office?" "Not yet," he said. "I wanted to think through who benefits from it first." She understood him immediately. "If the railroad comes through this section, it comes through the county," she said. "That changes the economics for every family in the eastern settlements. It changes the school. It changes whether this territory survives or fades," he said. "I've seen it go both ways. The counties the railroad skips die within a decade." "File it," she said. "File it with the state office and with the county commissioner simultaneously, and write the arguments for routing in your cover letter." She was already pulling paper toward her. "I'll help you frame the section about community benefit." The survey report was filed in April of 1883. The railroad routing decision was a complicated political process that took years and involved factors well beyond any single survey report. But Daniel's filing was noted and referenced, and when the routing decision came in 1885, the tracks running through Caldwell's eastern county exactly as the geological evidence had suggested they should, there were people who knew why. Theresa never claimed credit for it. Daniel never accepted credit for it alone. They had done it together, which was the only way they knew how to do things that mattered. Their second child arrived in 1884, a daughter, Margaret Ruth Mercer, who arrived with considerably less drama than James had, and who seemed from her earliest weeks to have inherited her mother's quality of contained, directed intensity and her father's gift for making other people feel at ease. She was, in Clara Werner's opinion, expressed often and with enormous satisfaction, the most beautiful baby that had been born in Caldwell in the 10 years since Clara had been keeping track. The house on the south side of town was extended. Daniel built a second bedroom and a study for Theresa, a proper study with bookshelves on 3 walls and a north-facing window, and enough space for the mathematical work that had increasingly, over the years of their marriage, expanded from pedagogy into something that looked more like original research. She had been corresponding with a professor at the University of Kansas, a Dr. Aldridge, who taught applied mathematics, since 1882, when she had sent him a paper she had written on simplified celestial calculation methods that included the derivation Daniel had discovered in the first winter of their acquaintance. Dr. Aldridge had responded with 40 years' worth of intellectual excitement compressed into 4 pages of extremely precise academic language. The correspondence had continued. In 1884, he had published a paper in the Kansas Academy of Sciences Proceedings that cited by name Theresa Barrett Mercer's simplified derivation method and gave her full credit for the innovation. Daniel had read the citation 3 times and then put the paper down and looked across the kitchen table at his wife, who was reading it with the very still expression that meant she was feeling something more than she was ready to show. "Theresa," he said. "I see it," she said. "Your name, in print. In a scientific journal." "I see it," she said again, and her voice was perfectly level and entirely unsteady at the same time. He reached across the table and took her hand. She gripped his back hard for a moment. "It took long enough," she said finally. "Yes," he said, "it did. There should be 10 more," she said. "There should be 100 people whose names should be in journals and are not because of who they were born as and not what they were capable of." "There should be," he agreed. "But yours is there," she looked at him, "because you did the derivation." "We did the derivation," he said. "You taught me the method, I found the shortcut. You recognized what it was." Aldridge published it. Between the 4 of us, 1 name in a journal. She almost laughed. It was not the kind of thing she laughed at exactly, but the absurdity of the mathematics of credit and attribution in the world of 1884 was sharp enough to produce something close. By 1886, Caldwell had grown beyond what the 1878 version of the town would have recognized. The railroad had come through the eastern county, and with it the expansion of settlement that always followed iron rails into the frontier. New families, new demands on the school, new questions about what the community was and what it wanted to be. Theresa navigated all of it with the same methodical ferocity she had brought to every institutional challenge, and Daniel was beside her, managing the practical and the interpersonal in the way that had become his specific contribution to everything they did together. James was 6 years old and learning his multiplication tables with a speed that caused his teacher, who was now Miss Cole, since Theresa had moved into a supervisory role that allowed her more time for the mathematical correspondence and less for daily classroom instruction, to write Theresa a note saying your son has an exceptional mathematical gift and a tendency to correct other students which requires management. To which Theresa wrote back, "I am aware of both tendencies and am working on the second one," which she was. Margaret at 2 was a different quality of creature, entirely sociable, physically bold, already demonstrating a preference for outdoor activity that her mother respected entirely, and her father encouraged with the specific delight of a man who had spent his own childhood running wild before the war had taken that freedom. She would be her own thing. They could see it already and they were glad. One evening in the late summer of 1886, when the children were asleep and the house was quiet, Daniel found Theresa on the back porch in the warm dark, sitting in the chair she kept there for stargazing, looking east at the sky. He brought 2 cups of coffee and sat in the chair beside her, and they sat in comfortable silence for a while, the way people sat who had been talking to each other for years and had gotten past the need to fill silence with more words. The sky to the east was magnificent. August in Kansas had a quality of sky that was its own argument for the frontier. The full dark when you were far enough from town lights, the Milky Way a river of density overhead, Polaris steady and exact in the north. "Do you remember," she said, "telling me that you came to Caldwell without a direction or a destination?" "November 1878, he said. "Yes. You have been here 8 years. 8 years, 3 months, and some days," he said. "I've stopped counting the days, but I remember the months." She turned her head to look at him. In the starlight, her face had the quality it had in good light, strong-boned, clear-eyed, entirely known to him and entirely capable of surprising him, which was the combination he had come to understand was what love meant in the long form. "Are you glad you stayed?" she asked. It was not a question with any anxiety in it. It was genuine curiosity. She asked genuine questions always, even about things that might have frightened a less secure person to ask. He looked at her for a moment. At the woman who had swung a lantern through a blizzard to bring him in from the dark, who had taught him to navigate by stars and had graded compositions at midnight and had fought school boards and filed survey reports and raised a son and a daughter and built a life that was genuinely, specifically hers, who had given him the thing he had not known he was missing, not rescue, not completion in the sense of filling a gap, but expansion. She had made him more than he had been, and he hoped, and had been told on occasion, in the direct way she had of saying things, that he had done the same for her. "Theresa," he said, "I am so glad I stayed that I can't think about the alternative without something going sideways in my chest." She reached over and took his hand. She did not say anything for a moment. "The lantern," she said, "the broken one on the windowsill." "Yes. I kept it because it was the moment I knew," she said, "when I saw you go into the storm. I had watched you all day and thought you were interesting, and when you went into that storm I thought, that man is going to die, and it landed inside me differently than it should have landed for a stranger." She paused. "So I lit the lantern and I waited, and when the chimney broke I kept the flame on the bare wick, and I kept the signal going because I needed you to find your way to the door." He held her hand and listened. "I needed you to," she said. "That was when I knew." They sat in the dark for a while longer, under the stars that she had taught him to read, while the prairie breathed around them and the children slept inside and the town of Caldwell moved through its evening somewhere to the west. He was exactly where he was supposed to be, in the way that 8 years of building a life in a place had made the place indistinguishable from the life itself. The lantern with the broken chimney was still on the windowsill. It would stay there. Some things you kept not because they were useful but because they were true, because they marked the moment a life turned from one direction to another and the marking mattered. He thought about the blizzard, the white dark and the cold that had been becoming the end of something, and then the light 3 slow arcs left, 2 sharp swings down, 3 slow arcs left cutting through it. He thought about walking toward it. He thought about the door opening and Theresa Barrett standing in the warmth with a bare flame burning on a wick and dark eyes, full of absolute certainty. He had thought in the first minute of that moment that she was extraordinary. He had been right. He had not known in that minute how right he had been, or how many forms her extraordinary quality would take, or how it would expand and deepen over 8 years of living alongside it. He had not known that loving her would mean being constantly challenged and constantly expanded, and never, not once in 8 years, being bored. He had not known about James or Margaret or the back porch under the Kansas stars, or the citations in scientific journals, or the survey reports that had changed the routing of a railroad. He had not known any of it. He was glad he had followed the light. Margaret Mercer, when she was old enough to understand stories, asked her parents how they had met. It was a question children asked, and Theresa and Daniel had developed a version of the answer suitable for young children: the storm, the light, the schoolhouse, the tea. The simple version. The version that was all true and contained only the outline. When Margaret was older, 12, with her mother's intensity and her father's patience, she asked again. And this time Theresa told her the fuller version, in the kitchen on a winter evening, while Daniel listened from across the table with his coffee, filling in details when Theresa paused, the two of them telling it together in the way that long-shared stories were told, each one knowing which parts the other would leave out and supplying them. Margaret listened with complete attention. When they finished, she was quiet for a moment. "You calculated that he would do something reckless," she said to her mother. "So you prepared the signal in advance." "Yes," Theresa said. "That was very smart," Margaret said. "It was practical," Theresa said. "And then he came," Margaret said, looking at her father, "even though it was dangerous." "Yes," Daniel said. "Because you wanted to help her," Margaret said. He considered this. "Because I had looked at her for about 3 minutes and already couldn't quite imagine not helping her," he said, "even though she absolutely did not need it." Theresa, across the table, had that expression on her face, the one that was not quite a smile and contained everything. She met his eyes and held them for a moment. "I did not need help," she agreed, "but it was very nice to have company." James, 14 and pretending not to listen from behind his mathematics text, looked up briefly with an expression of elaborate disinterest that fooled nobody in the room, and then went back to his reading. But the corner of his mouth had done something that his father recognized, because it was the same thing his own mouth did at moments of involuntary warmth. And Daniel looked at his son bent over his book, and his daughter with her mother's dark eyes asking exact questions, and his wife across the table with the lantern on the windowsill visible through the kitchen door. And he felt the full specific weight of the life he had been given when he had followed a light through a blizzard and stepped through the right door. Outside, the Kansas winter was setting in the way it always did: steady, enormous, indifferent to the specifics of any particular life. Inside, the stove was warm and the lamps were lit and the books were on the shelves and the mathematics was on the chalkboard that Theresa kept in the study, covered in the notation of a mind that had never stopped working. Everything that mattered was accounted for. Everything was here. The drifter had stopped drifting. The teacher had found her equal. The lantern on the windowsill kept its broken vigil between the past and the present, and the light it had carried through the worst storm of that winter of 1878 had not gone out. It had grown into something that lit the whole house, and that, as Theresa Barrett Mercer would have said, with the precision she brought to all conclusions, was the correct outcome.